Notice this. Ever since the first human being raised their eyes to the night sky, filled with shimmering stars and unfathomable mysteries, one question has transcended generations, civilizations, empires, and ruins. When will it all end? The fascination with the end is not a modern anomaly, nor a cultural accident, nor the isolated delusion of religious fanatics, conspiracy theorists, or lunatics. It is, in truth, a structural trait of human consciousness itself, a dark and inevitable reflection of what Carl Gustav Jung described as the collective shadow of humanity, that hidden archetype, feared and often projected outward where it becomes monsters, wrathful gods, or apocalyptic prophecies. It is, in essence, an ancient dance between light and shadow, between order and chaos, where fragile and arrogant consciousness constantly finds itself crushed by the vastness of the unknown. The obsession with the end of the world is not merely a matter of irrational fear. Paradoxically, it is an unconscious search for meaning, for unlike any other animal, the human being knows they will die. This awareness of finitude creates a devastating psychic paradox. We live as if we were eternal, but we carry, in every cell of our unconscious, the brutal certainty of extinction. This generates an existential discomfort so overwhelming that the psyche finds a way to transmute it, shifting the fear of personal death onto the idea of a collective, cosmic, total end. It is the old trick of the unconscious. By turning personal drama into a collective narrative, the individual finds psychological relief, albeit temporary. Because it is far easier to accept that the entire universe will collapse than to confront one's own internal collapse. But, make no mistake, this phenomenon is not merely psychological. It has cultural, historical, and spiritual roots that span millennia. In Sumer, priests proclaimed divine catastrophes whenever the stars aligned in unusual ways. In Babylon, astrology was born largely from the desire to decipher omens in the sky and anticipate the inescapable. In ancient Egypt, the Book of the Dead already described cycles of destruction and rebirth, reflecting a cosmology in which chaos and order eternally alternated. The Mayans, with their complex calendar, were wrongly accused of predicting the end of the world in 2012. A distorted interpretation of a cycle that actually symbolized transformation, not annihilation. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the apocalypse becomes almost an obsession. The Book of Revelation, written by John in Patmos, is a literary work that blends mystical vision, political critique, and prophetic delirium. There, beasts rise from the sea, stars fall from the sky, plagues devastate the earth, and everything culminates in a final judgment promising to separate the righteous from the wicked, saints from sinners. It is the ultimate fantasy of the human unconscious, that current suffering is part of a higher plan, and that in the end there will be justice, a cosmic, unquestionable, and definitive justice. And this justice is not merely desired. It is demanded by the very psychological structure of man, who, incapable of accepting chaos as an intrinsic element of reality, projects onto the cosmos the need for a final, absolute, definitive order. Carl Jung deeply understood this mechanism. For him, these visions were not supernatural premonitions, but symbolic manifestations of profound psychic processes. The apocalypse, Jung said, is the symbol of psychic transformation. Just as the ego, when confronting its own shadow, experiences the sensation that everything is collapsing, humanity projects this internal process onto the external world, expecting or fearing a cataclysm that is, in truth, a mirror of its own existential crisis. And this crisis, as terrifying as it may seem, is actually an invitation to transcend the limitations of the ego and access deeper levels of consciousness. However, it would be naive to imagine that these prophecies arise solely from unconscious mechanisms. There are also sociological, economic, and political factors at play. Every time a civilization enters collapse, whether due to wars, economic crises, pandemics, or climate change, the collective unconscious activates, generating a wave of apocalyptic predictions. This is because, deep down, social collapse echoes psychic collapse. External chaos resonates with internal chaos, and suddenly, false prophets spring up like weeds, promising salvation, enlightenment, or at least a comforting explanation for the absurdity of suffering. This dynamic has repeated itself throughout history. During the Black Death in medieval Europe, flagellants marched through cities, whipping their own bodies while proclaiming the end of days. They believed deeply that their physical pain could appease divine wrath and prevent the world's destruction. In the 20th century, during the Cold War, the fear of nuclear holocaust replaced religious images of the apocalypse with atomic mushrooms and air raid sirens. And now, in the 21st century, we live under the diffuse shadow of climate collapse, pandemics, uncontrollable artificial intelligence, and hybrid wars, which rekindle, in new forms, the ancient anxiety about the end. What few realize is that this constant anticipation of the end often serves as a mechanism of escape, because while we are busy waiting for the apocalypse, we avoid confronting the apocalypses that happen within us every day. The collapse of our values, the fragmentation of human relationships, the dissolution of meaning, the existential void, screaming amid the deafening noise of hyperconnectivity. The human mind cannot bear a vacuum of meaning. When social order seems to crumble, the collective unconscious fills that void with mythologies of destruction. It's as if it whispers, "If we don't know how to live, at least we will know how it all ends." And there is, strange as it sounds, a perverse comfort in this, because if everything is destined to end, then nothing really matters. It becomes the ultimate excuse for nihilism, for existential surrender, for the abandonment of personal responsibility. After all, why fight, grow, or evolve if Judgment Day is inevitable? But this narrative does not always manifest destructively. In esoteric, alchemical, and Gnostic traditions, the apocalypse is understood as revelation, which is, in fact, the literal meaning of the word in ancient Greek, apokalypsis, meaning to unveil, to lift the veil. From this perspective, the end of the world is not an external event, but an internal metamorphosis. It is the symbolic death of the ego, followed by the rebirth of higher consciousness. The apocalypse, therefore, does not destroy. It liberates. And here lies the point that most people do not understand. The apocalypse is not something that happens out there, but something that happens in here. It is an intimate, profound, non-negotiable process. The destruction is not of the world, but of illusion. Jung saw this clearly in the dreams of his patients. Dreams of floods, earthquakes, explosions, and fires did not announce literal disasters, but rather the urgent need for inner transformation. The old self must die for something new to be born. And when the individual resists this process, the psyche responds with symptoms, emotional collapses, overwhelming depressions, and existential crises that often can only be understood through the lens of symbolic language. Because the psyche does not ask for permission, it only warns. And when we don't hear the whisper, it screams. When we ignore the scream, it knocks us down. The external collapse is merely a mirror of the internal collapse that has been avoided for too long. And the most intriguing thing is realizing how the modern world, supposedly rational, scientific, and technological, has not managed, and never will manage, to rid itself of these apocalyptic narratives. It merely wrapped them in new aesthetics. Today, the four horsemen of the apocalypse do not arrive riding mythical beasts, but appear in climate change graphs, pandemic statistical models, economic collapse forecasts, and simulations of uncontrolled artificial intelligence. The collective unconscious has simply updated its symbols to communicate in the language of the present. The anxiety remains intact, the fear remains intact, and the illusion of control, this has become the new religion. But the archetype is the same. The anxiety is the same. the shadow remains intact, and the search for meaning in the face of finitude continues to be the hidden engine behind this entire psychic machinery. Because deep down, every fear of the end of the world is, in truth, the fear of the end of one's own inner world. It is the anguish of psychic death, of the collapse of certainties, of the dissolution of the ego, and as long as there is humanity, there will be apocalypse. Because the apocalypse is not an event, it is a permanent structure of the collective psyche. This realization is disconcerting, but also liberating. Because if we understand that the apocalypse is a projection of our own shadow, then we can finally begin to integrate that shadow, instead of being devoured by it. Jung teaches us that what we resist persists, and what we confront dissolves. The true end of the world is not the destruction of earth. It is the destruction of ignorance, of unconsciousness, of psychic alienation. That is why every time a new apocalyptic prediction arises, whether from false prophets, algorithms, or misinterpreted scientific theories, we should first ask, what part of our psyche is speaking through this narrative? What transformation are we avoiding? What pain do we not want to face? Because deep down, the search for the end is the search for a new beginning. But the ego, in its childish arrogance, prefers to imagine the collapse of the cosmos rather than accept its own inner metamorphosis. And if there is a hidden lesson in this endless cycle of endings and beginnings, it is that the external apocalypse only becomes inevitable when we ignore the internal one. When we refuse the call to transformation, reality itself takes charge of imposing collapse, whether through personal, social, environmental, or spiritual crises. And thus, the old Hermetic axiom proves true once more: as above, so below. As within, so without. The true prophet, therefore, is not the one who announces future disasters, but the one who recognizes the signs of internal collapse and transforms them into opportunities for rebirth. And, perhaps, deep down, this is why predictions of the end of the world will never cease. Because they are in truth unconscious reminders that the soul's journey is cyclical, that every birth requires a death, that every light casts a shadow, and that every end is in fact a doorway to something our rational mind is not yet capable of comprehending. This is, after all, the tragic and magnificent condition of being human: to carry, within the same heart, the fear of the end and the hope of rebirth. And as long as this paradox pulses within our souls, there will always be someone looking to the horizon and asking, with a voice trembling with eternity, "Is this when it all ends?" But perhaps what scares us the most is not the end itself, but the uncertainty, because the unknown paralyzes more than any death sentence. And this uncertainty feeds on the very condition of being human, a creature that inhabits the narrow space between two great mysteries, birth and death. And within that tenuous space, laden with anguish, the being,